Thank you, Cody, for that introduction. I wish I could say that it is with honor and pleasure that I address this group tonight. Actually, it's with much fear and trepidation. I consider this presentation a midterm paper for myself, because even though, as Cody has indicated, my area of expertise, so-called, is East Asian religions and cultures, actually, I'm more familiar, as you may imagine, with the Chinese and the Japanese side rather than the Korean side. And so I've always felt that there's a missing link in my exposure. And it was 2 years ago when I participated in the fall fellowship of the Korea Society that I really made a stab at trying to understand this part of the East Asian experience. And I promised the director of the fellowship program, Ms. Yongjin Choi, that I would do something to repay the generosity of the program. And this is what we came up with. Because on that occasion, when I participated in the fellowship, I lamented the fact that, yes, it is true that there are all these interesting and very impressive things that have gone on in Korea. Unfortunately, that part of the story has not been told in a very general, overarching way, comprehensive way, to people with a general interest in East Asia. So it is my very modest attempt to try to address that issue. But of course, it is a topic way too big. And so to borrow the title of a book of our current president, The Audacity of Hope, actually what I'm trying to do tonight is the audacity of ignorant folly. Because I know so little, that's why I even try to do it. So in that sense, then, let us begin. So this is the topic that I have volunteered to do, and it was also half suggested to me. Now, of course, East Asia is easy to define. We are trying to cover all three areas. There is, of course, a Southeast Asian expression of this same movement, which is, of course, Vietnam. And of course, about that, I know even less. So I'm not even going to make a try to try to include Vietnam in my narrative. But what is Neo-Confucianism? That's the issue for tonight. Now, Neo-Confucianism is a term coined by Western scholars to describe a phenomenon that took place in China in the 11th, starting in the 11th century, all the way down to the 20th. But then it's also a similar phenomenon that took place in Korea in the 14th and 15th centuries, and then all the way down, and then in Japan even later, from the 16th century on. So it is kind of a wave-like development that first engulfed China, and then it swept across to Korea, and then finally reaching Japan, as we can imagine. But Neo-Confucianism has been characterized generally by students of East Asian studies to be a reactionary, very rigid, very fossilized pattern of thought, espoused by, again, to borrow a term among more liberal members of academia, as the thinking of dead yellow men. And so it's generally understood to be a very sexist, oppressive, very backward-looking kind of an ideology that served the interests of the political order, which, of course, had as its central interest to create a very stable, very hierarchical society. And there were, of course, a lot of victims of the system. Women, young people, minorities, and that kind of thing. But that's not the Neo-Confucianism that I want to talk about. And that Neo-Confucianism, of course, has been roundly criticized by the more progressive elements in East Asia since the end of the 19th century. And it has resulted in, of course, a great deal of soul-searching, a great deal of reevaluation of the traditions in China, in Korea, and in Japan. And it has also resulted in almost reflexive rejection of that heritage. So that's not the kind of Neo-Confucianism I want to talk about. Instead, I want to talk about it as an ethical religious movement spearheaded by a small elite group of scholars, yes, the dead yellow men, and at the same time fired by visions of a new socio-political order grounded on moral principles. Now, that's a mouthful. What I have in mind is that in this milieu of Buddhist dominance in East Asia, prior to the rise of this movement, there arose stirrings of a new vision, of a new way of looking at this social order, a revitalized way of looking at how human beings should conduct themselves, should arrange themselves into some kind of a cohesive, harmonious social order. And in my humble opinion, this movement, which we call in the West Neo-Confucianism, is very much reminiscent of the Renaissance or the Reformation that took place in Europe, even later. And that's something that I want to underscore. In other words, this impulse to rejuvenate, to reinvigorate a tradition happened in China, in Korea, in Japan, in a way that is very similar to that same impulse that informed a resurgent West that catapulted it out of its medieval slumber, if you will. Now, if that is our agreed upon premise, then let's take a look at what are some of the characteristics of this movement. It's a critique of the prevailing ideology, which was Buddhism. In China, in Korea, in Japan, likewise. Many of the central figures of the movement were themselves very familiar with and perhaps were once participants of this Buddhist ideology, this Buddhist worldview. And they became critics of that very worldview. And they undertook a very systematic, a very well-considered attempt to first reform it and then to supersede it and to reject it outright, because they found in this rediscovered Confucian tradition something far more valuable, something far more, perhaps to them, intelligible, so that they could then apply that repossessed way to their own lives and to society at large. And in that regard, it is also a movement that focuses on this fundamentalist yearning. Let me try to see if I can use the laser pointer. To return to the beginning of the tradition. And that's why it's called Neo. Because obviously, it is no longer the original version of that movement. It cannot be. But it is a very good faith attempt to try to recover that original vision. But of course, in the process of doing so, it revised it. And in my opinion, it refined it as well. And so as we proceed to go on to talk about the Chinese expression of it, the Korean expression of it, and then finally the Japanese expression of it, we can see this yearning being absolutely confidently expressed. And talking about confidence then, we are also talking about the confidence in the absolute correctness of the beliefs. And it's in that sense that I call it an ethical religious movement. in my opinion, Neo-Confucianism is interesting not so much as a philosophy. Now, I'm no student of philosophy. I think for most of us, philosophy makes our eyes glaze over. It is so divorced from everyday meaning in life. But if it's an ethical religious movement, then it is much closer to our very being. It is that which informs our conduct, our way of looking at the world, and our way of dealing with other people, and of course, by extension, with nature, with the animals, with the cosmos. And what the Neo-Confucians in China, in Korea, and Japan did was to apply that idea, that whole set of beliefs, and to be confident that what they're doing is of utmost importance and, of course, of utmost correctness. But more importantly, it is also a belief that is attainable. It is not so far-fetched, it's not so remotely possible that it can only be an ultimate hope. It's more than hope. It is indeed a way of informing our own very being, and the realization that it can be achieved in one's own life, in one's own time. And then, of course, once we're characterizing this movement as a religious movement, then we have to accept the inevitable fact, which is that it is filled with tension, because maybe people subscribe to the same set of texts, of scriptural sources, if you will. And I will have an opportunity to talk about the corpus of the Neo-Confucian movement. But at the same time, the texts are frozen. And in order to make the tradition a living tradition, then those words will have to be interpreted and applied to personal lives. And it's there that people differ in the interpretations. And so it's a movement filled with debates and acrimonious criticisms of one another. And of course, for all of us who somehow participate in any kind of religious tradition, we're quite aware of that possibility. And we accept that as a price to pay, because after all, those words speak to us in various ways. And that's why we can see the diversity and the pluralism of all those religious traditions. All right, so what is this Neo-Confucian tradition that we're going to address tonight? I've identified a number of terms for our consideration. First is the so-called, in Chinese, Daoxue, right? In Korean, Tohak, and then in Japanese, Dongaku. It's about the way, the Tao. The way speaks for everything. It's a catch-all phrase. Right? In one sense, it is the entire socio-political order that has been ordained by a higher authority. And of course, in this case, the higher authority is Tian in Chinese, Chong, right, in Korean, and Ten in Japanese. And that higher authority serving as the absolute ultimate, serving as the numinous, is the one that issues forth, right, this way. And it is this way that when realized, when applied to human affairs in particular, that would create this harmonious, perfect society. And when the human society is perfect, according to this Neo-Confucian belief, then ultimately as well, right, nature will be perfect. The entire cosmos will be perfect. It is that belief that inspires these Neo-Confucian scholars to acquire this sense of mission for themselves, to ascribe that responsibility to themselves, and to do something about their own lives, and to then extend that to the outside world out there, so that indeed human beings can claim co-equality with heaven and earth, with Tian and Di in Chinese. And who are these people who, when they're capable of exercising that role, of being able to lead the way to, shall we say, the New Jerusalem, the Promised Land? Those are the so-called sages, the Shengren. So it is also called Shengxue, right? The way of the sages, Songhak and then Sengaku in Korean, in Japanese respectively. So it is this movement that teaches people how to become a sage. A sage in this East Asian setting is not someone who knows a lot. To be sure, that might be one of the requirements. But more importantly, a sage is someone who is ethically and behaviorally so exemplary that the person inspires in others the will, the yearning to imitate, right? To do the same, so that by that concentric circular way, the whole society can be transformed. And so basically then, this Neo-Confucian teaching emphasizes how to be a sage. But being a sage means what? Being a sage means being cognizant of this ultimate principle that governs the entire universe. This Li in Chinese, Yi in Korean, and then Li in Japanese. It's a study about principle, or I put the possibility of multiplicity there. That's why principle or principles. Because basically, the Neo-Confucian assumption is also quite ambiguous. There is, of course, one overarching Li, but this Li is expressed in a multifarious way. The basic Neo-Confucian slogan is, there's one principle, but its particularizations are many. So it is indeed through a very intense study of the various manifestations of these smaller Li that ultimately the final Li, the overarching Li, the ultimate Li can be understood. And that is what, of course, results in this emphasis on scholastic pursuit. Right? Because if you don't study, you cannot appropriate this Li. At least that's one way of looking at it. Because at the same time, so study is important. But then resorting to or culminating in your heart and mind, right? Xin in Chinese, Sim in Korean, and Shin in Japanese is likewise equally important. In other words, there is something built into this human constitution that enables the appropriation of the Li that may be understood in one case to be outside, but at the same time, it is this inner dimension of the human heart and mind that allows this Li to be understood deep inside as well. And it is this Xin, this Sim, this Shin that is so unique to the human species. What I mean by that is that it is the Neo-Confucian belief that it is only the human mind that is capable of appropriating this Li. And it is there that we can see how Neo-Confucianism differs from the basic Buddhist assumption. Because the basic Buddhist assumption is about the equality of all beings. Does a dog have Buddha nature? Of course a dog has Buddha nature. So the Zen Buddhists would argue. But this Xin Right? This Xin is different. Human beings alone possess it as a potentiality, as something that is there, but that awaits to be nurtured and cultured, so that indeed, when it expands, when it develops, when it culminates in that perfect state, that's when you can appropriate the Li. So it remains a possibility. It is not an actuality already. And of course, different Neo-Confucians will have different approaches to that, to the argument. And finally, we're also talking about something that is substantial, something that is solid and practical. That's why it's also called 实学, right? The study of something that is real, that is not empty, that is not metaphysical and abstruse, something so divorced from daily life that we're really being armchair philosophers. No, it is something that is true to life, something that is practical in its application. So what I'm trying to say is that all these different terms can be subsumed under this very big title, right, of Neo-Confucianism. And at different times and for different individuals, they may favor one or another term just so that they can display their own particular understanding and preference and interpretation of what it is that they're doing. So, what then ultimately does Neo-Confucianism aspire to achieve? I can say with some certainty that ultimately that Neo-Confucian goal is to attain these two things: inner sagehood and outer kingliness. In Chinese is 内圣外王. To be a sage inside means to be that perfect moral paragon. To be someone who is not only internally impeccable and unassailable, but at the same time, someone who is learned, someone who is wise. It cannot be one or the other. It has to be both. It's almost like the Christian insistence on doing good works and having faith together as a dual accomplishment in order to be worthy, right, of their faith. So, and that is inner sagehood. And of course, to achieve that, of course, one needs to be forever vigilant. One needs to be always on guard. One needs to be persistent in that pursuit. And it's a lifelong undertaking. But that is only part of this Neo-Confucian framework, because along with 内圣, there's also the requirement for 外王. This external ability, first of all, expressed in the inevitable insistence on public service. In other words, you cannot lock yourself up and pursue your own holiness, your own personal salvation as a recluse, right? as a hermit. No, you need to plunge into human affairs. You need to mingle with other human beings in a leadership role, in something that impacts on the people around you, but then by extension on society at large. And of course, the ultimate goal is for the universal improvement of the cosmos. And it is in that sense that there's this outer extension, right, of the Neo-Confucian pursuit. And then public service is a rather vague idea. How do you do it? In other words, what should you do as an official, as a parent of the people that would create that kind of social order? You have to have the administrative skills and the emphasis on benevolence. In other words, you are not going to exploit and oppress the people in order to climb further up. That would be very much in contradiction to that Neo-Confucian goal. You have to have that idea of being someone who will bring about a general social transformation through your public service. And in that whole connection, let me quote one very synoptic, self-professed goal uttered by this Chinese Neo-Confucian, Zhang Zai, who in fact was a northern Song dynasty individual who predated Zhu Xi, the great synthesizer of the Chinese part of the Neo-Confucian movement, and who has become such a model, such an inspiration for the other Neo-Confucians in China, and then of course in Korea and in Japan. So what did Zhang Zai say? First of all, it is to establish the mind and heart of heaven and earth. In other words, to tap oneself into that almost secret message, that mandate that inspires people to pursue that ultimate goal of inner sagehood and outer kingliness. So, in other words, to really probe and fathom that mind and heart, right, of the supreme absolute ultimate. But then, in the same breath, right, we need to also provide livelihood that is good living for the people, for the multitudes. In other words, that personal search stated in that first sentence has to be complemented by the practical result of that search, which is to benefit the people through the provision of livelihood. That is, that they can live peacefully, prosperously, without harassment from the government. Right? But then at the same time, how do we do it? How can we accomplish this dual goal? Well, it is to rediscover, to repossess the teaching of the former sages that had been truncated, that had disappeared. And to a great extent, who's to blame for this? Some Confucians who have lost their way, but more importantly, Buddhists who became usurpers, right, of this dominant tradition in China, Korea, and Japan, and so they had to be the target, right, of this Neo-Confucian resurgence. And that's how you can rediscover, you can reinvigorate this truncated teaching. And so in my later discussion, I'll talk about all these very partisan attempts made to try to do exactly that, right? To rediscover, to re-identify that part of the truncated teaching. And ultimately, for what purpose? To create peace for future generations. So we're not just concerned about a contemporary improvement of society at large in our own lifetime. We have to look to the future. We have to create a social order that would benefit, that would enable the people to have their livelihood, to have an unharassed form of living. So that is the goal of this movement. Now, of course, at this point, maybe I should pause a little bit to make a disclaimer. I may be painting too rosy a picture, because I'm quite mindful, because of my own particular upbringing and philosophical inclination. I'm quite mindful of the abuses and the oppressiveness of this Neo-Confucian movement. After all, right, most Chinese would say, particularly in the last 150 years, right, they're victims of this Neo-Confucian teaching, so that China has remained so backward, right, so that Chinese government had become so oppressive, so that women and young people had been so disadvantaged. I'm quite mindful of that. In fact, at one point, when I was younger, I was myself a severe critic of that as well. But at the same time, just because of what Neo-Confucianism had become as part of that Chinese, Korean, and Japanese historical unfolding, should in no way detract us from thinking that the goal of this movement is still worthwhile, is still noble. In the same way, right, if we look at Christianity only from the perspective, right, of the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, the numerous abuses of the church, perhaps that's one way for historians to look at that movement. But at the same time, that should not in any way take us away from the nobility of that Christian vision, right? From the teaching of that Christ. And what I'm trying to do is precisely that, right? To try to recapture the original impulse of this movement. Subsequent abuses and distortions or misinterpretations notwithstanding, right? This is my goal tonight. I think I'm stuck. I can no longer advance. Oh! Delayed reaction. All right, so what is the Chinese part of this story? This is going to be the next topic of my address. So you're forerunners of this movement in the 9th century, in the person of Han Yu. I forgot to include his dates. He's a Tang Dynasty figure, best known for his very severe criticism of this blind belief in Buddhism. He's most famous for his memorial submitted to the Tang Emperor on the occasion of the arrival of a finger bone of the Buddha. And the Tang Emperor was going to go out of the palace to prostrate himself in front of this relic, right, of the Buddha. And Han Yu was greatly offended by that servile attitude of the Chinese monarch. And of course, that shows his partisanship, if you will. Right? But at the same time, Han Yu was also very much remembered to be someone who kind of reinitiated the whole inquiry into what this Tao is, what this way is all about. Because, of course, the word Tao in Chinese, Do in Korean, and Do in Japanese, is used also to describe the teaching of the Buddha. In fact, the Taoists basically monopolized that term as well. After all, they call themselves Taoists. But still, in Han Yu's understanding, this Tao has a decided Confucian meaning. And is very much interested in going back to this Tao, to this original teaching of the sages. And so he sounded, shall we say, the first beacon call to go back to a time before the Buddhists. In fact, what later Neo-Confucians complained about was that perhaps he didn't go back far enough. because he would advise that people go back to, to the Han Dynasty and maybe beyond that. But for the later, more mature Neo-Confucians, they want to go all the way back to the original Confucius. And that's exactly what these Northern Song Dynasty Neo-Confucians were trying to do, beginning with Zhou Dunyi and then Zhang Zai and Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi. I've left out the fifth person because his ideas totally escaped me. And that was Shao Yong. Shao Yong is a true philosopher. And I don't feel comfortable dealing with pure philosophers. So, who were these people and what did they talk about? They were unified in one activity. And that was that because they knew so much about their enemy, the Buddhists. Many of them were at one time or another very much steeped in that Buddhist discourse. Many of them had friends who were Buddhists. Many of them had, in fact, written works commenting on various aspects of the Buddhist teaching. But they were uniform in one thing, which was that Buddhism was inadequate. That's a mild criticism, that somehow it was partial in addressing the human predicament, the human problem. But in the end, by the time we reached the Cheng brothers, not only was Buddhism inadequate, it was absolutely harmful. So there's a much stronger critical standpoint. In other words, it is because of Buddhism that people's lives have been ruined, that people's attention had been diverted, that indeed human society was so hurt by this dominant ideology that came not without some kind of xenophobic flair that came from the outside. It was, no matter how strongly identified it had become, right, with Chinese culture, somehow the alien origin of this teaching must not be forgotten. And so for these Northern Song masters, the need was felt to go back, not only to the Tang and then the Han period, but to go all the way back to pre-Qin times. That is, before the first emperor of Qin burned all those classics. To, in other words, recover the original impulse of that movement. And what they collectively did, and tonight is because of time constraint, I cannot really go into any detailed discussion of all their teachings. But the collective aim was to say that there were certain teachings within that original Confucian movement that had so much universal validity that they had to be reinvigorated so that the current age could benefit. And that created one very interesting phenomenon, which is the whole notion of the correct lineage. In Chinese, I forgot to include that in my PowerPoint. In Chinese, it's called Dao Tong. Now, the tradition, the whole orthodox transmission of the way. And the way they recreated this Confucian history was to say, well, in the beginning of humanity, there were these culture heroes. And they had already discovered this secret message from Tian, right, from heaven. And they passed that along to designated individuals in human history. But of course, since they were Chinese, they were very partial, right, to the Chinese transmission of it. And so they would say, well, think of all the three dynasties, the Shang, and then Xia, and then Shang, and then Zhou dynasties. So the founders of these dynastic reigns were all privy, right, to this secret message. And then beyond the founders of the three dynasties, now it would be Confucius, who, even though he was not the founder of any dynastic reign, he was the uncrowned king. He was someone who deservedly should be a dynastic founder, but his time was a very difficult time. And so he was denied that role. And yet, precisely because he was denied that role, therefore, he would carry forward this message through a different channel, through a different transmission. It's almost like the claim made by those ancient Jewish prophets. Right? Yes, originally, God's message was given to the patriarchs, right? To the military leaders of the people of Israel. But then, because of the truncation beyond David and Solomon, all of a sudden, a different group of people would be singled out to receive this message, namely the prophets themselves. Now the kings are no longer recipients of this message anymore. In fact, they would have to listen to the prophets now, so that the prophets would be deemed the correct transmitters, right, of that message. And then what these northern Song masters did was precisely to do that. Right? So Confucius would now be the carrier of this message. And from him, it would be transmitted to Mencius. But then it stopped. For beyond Mencius, no one worthy, no one deserving would carry that forward anymore. And that's why it's truncated. It stopped. And now it's time to rediscover that, to revive that. Who might it be? Now, of course, they didn't say as much. But, of course, they would imply, right, that they are the ones, since they rediscovered this fact, that they should be, therefore, looked at as the contemporary transmitters of the Tao. And in a sense, that's the point made by Zhu, the next one. And I kind of bold-faced his name because he is of such paramount importance in this whole discussion of Neo-Confucianism. Whether it's in China or Korea or Japan, Zhu was the man. Zhu was the single most important individual in all of this history of Neo-Confucianism. And that's why he deserves to be bold-faced. It's Zhu's argument that this truncated message is now going through the Northern Song masters, and of course, he would now be the inheritor of this message. It's a bold claim. It's a prophetic claim. It's one claim that got him into a lot of trouble. He was branded a heterodox individual who needed to be banned and punished. And indeed he was. But what he did was to advance this argument in the most concrete, absolutely impressive way, because he now was able to identify the texts, the scriptural sources, to basically substantiate that claim. And the way he did it was to single out 4 texts called the 4 books. And I'll talk about that later on. And so his efficacy was that these 4 books would serve as the most authoritative scriptural materials, the study of which will enable all to go back to the Tao, to the way. And through his disciples, in fact, his son-in-law and some others, that argument and that corpus of texts would be preserved, would be further advanced. Now, it is, of course, noteworthy that in his lifetime, Zhu Xi never succeeded in pushing his ideas for universal acceptance. On the contrary, right? He was very much dismissed as a crazy guy who was so antiquarian, so totally idiosyncratic, right? That's not to be taken seriously. But it's thanks to the next dynastic reign, ironically, an alien reign, that of the Mongols. Now, the Mongols couldn't care less about this indigenous Chinese, very stuffy tradition. But at the same time, the Mongols realized that they needed a group of able, upright individuals to rule a country. The famous realization, or the famous argument made by one advisor to Kublai Khan was, yes, you can conquer the realm from atop the horse, but you cannot rule it from atop the horse. Right? You need to get down and roll up your sleeves and do something serious about taking care of the affairs of the people. And whom would you call? A group of Confucian-minded scholars. And so you have these individuals who all traced their intellectual foundation back to Zhu Xi. And now Zhu Xi would be the one, right? The one who has almost single-handedly revived this truncated tradition. And the amazing thing is that because of them, Zhao Fu, who was captured in the south when the Mongols were still trying to consolidate their conquest of China, and he was brought to the north. And there he taught his understanding, right, of Zhu Xi's message, and he would be succeeded by these other individuals, all of whom basically agreed with that message and did their utmost to make sure that this Zhu Xi understanding, right, of this Dao Tong, this formal transmission of the way, would be preserved. And so, actually, I want to go back because I want to, maybe I've skipped the slides a little bit, but that's okay. In my own train of thought, let me try to identify some of these texts that Zhu Xi and others have identified or have subsequently created so that we can see precisely the kind of agreed upon authority that the Neo-Confucians subscribe to, so that we can talk further. So the four books encompassing these four, right? Great learning. I must have, okay. I must have inverted the slides. So let me come here first. So the great learning, the doctrine of the mean, the analects, and the mentions. They had been in existence, of course, for a long time. But it was thanks to Zhu Xi that they were grouped together as a collection, as one consolidated set of texts. And again, at the risk of making too big a comparison or too forced a comparison, I want to argue that indeed it is also the identification of the four Gospels, right, in the New Testament. Finally, right, in the second and from the 2nd century onward, that would consolidate this Christian understanding of the message that was Jesus. So the four books were identified to be the entire corpus, right, of of this original Confucian vision. But then at the same time, there would be commentaries, annotations, additional works that would make them more meaningful, right, to people in the current world. And so you have, actually, the 5 classics predated the 4 books, and they had been an authority, representative, of that Confucian tradition before the 4 books. And now they became secondary in importance. Why? Because they predated Confucius. They were proto-Confucian instead of truly Confucian. Yes, to be sure, they contained the Tao. But just as the so-called Old Testament books, right, only served as a way station, right, to the final realization of God's plan in Jesus, therefore, the 5 classics served as a way station, right, to allow the Confucian message to come through. Then you have the classic of filial piety, something that was compiled in the Han Dynasty. But now, since filial piety has become such a cardinal virtue among Confucians, now it has been given a place of prominence. But interestingly enough, you also have this text, 小学, elementary learning, compiled by Zhu Xi. And so Zhu Xi, as the interpreter, right, as the self-styled prophet of the Song Dynasty, has now become himself a sage-like figure. Right? His writings would now serve as the very paragon of this Neo-Confucian interpretation. And then again, his writings on family rituals. Because after all, Confucianism should not be an empty philosophical discourse. It should have practical implications on daily life. So how do you live life as a Confucian, as an aspiring sage? And then another compilation by Zhu Xi with a collaborator, reflections on things at hand, the Jin Si Lu in Chinese, which in fact contained the teachings of all the Northern Song masters that I talked about. So he made selections from their writings, and then he commented on them, and that became yet itself a classic. And then finally, an official, governmental, promulgated set of authoritative texts known as the Compendium on Nature and Principle. And now you have this entire corpus being subscribed to by every Neo-Confucian practitioner, whether it's a Chinese or Korean or Japanese. And you now have something that you can identify. So let's take a look at now the Korean part of the story. Of course, Confucian writings had found their way to Korea fairly early, during the time of the Three Kingdoms period. But let us not forget that at the same time, it's the Buddhists who were very much in control of articulating the official ideology of all the subsequent centuries in Korea. And of course, since this Neo-Confucian movement was fundamentally anti-Buddhist, you can see that for a long time, this Buddhist custody of the Confucian texts or of some of these Neo-Confucian writings would not be given any kind of prominence until Anhyang. Now, of course, there are all kinds of debates going on. Perhaps some of you know more about this than I do. That others might also have contributed to the very frontal understanding of the Neo-Confucian message. But there's no doubt that An had played a very significant role, because he was the one who found himself in Mongol China, thanks to the very interesting relationship between the Mongol emperor and the Korean king, the Goryeo king, and his descendants. And so there's a lot of back and forth traffic going on, and many of these Korean elites were brought to Dadu, Beijing later on, to mingle with the Chinese Neo-Confucians, Zhao Fu and Xu Heng and others. And so there's a great deal of interaction, direct interaction, right, between the Korean scholars and the Chinese Neo-Confucian scholars. And that's how An Hyang brought Zhu Xi's ideas back to Korea. Right? He was the one who was greatly excited about this discovery, and of course he was the one who pushed for the Korean adoption, right, of this Neo-Confucian outlook. And he would be succeeded by Shek, and he was the superintendent of this royal college, right, this Songgunguan, that taught a whole new generation of scholars, all subscribing to that very idea of replacing the domination of Buddhism with the Confucian vision, and of creating a new social order based upon the Confucian ideas. And Zhong Mengzhu is, of course, someone who immediately comes to mind. Now, of course, he was not a member of the next dynastic reign, because he died as a martyr, if you will, right? Because he refused to serve the new dynasty, and yet he was someone who very much articulated that Neo-Confucian belief. To begin with, I mean, take a look at his name, Mengzhu, right? Dreaming of the Zhou. More specifically, I would say dreaming of the Duke of Zhou, because Confucius, in his Analects, right, would comment on the need to be in touch, right, with the original teaching of the sages by constantly having a conversation with the Duke of Zhou. And then he said, well, I'm getting old, I no longer dream of meeting the Duke of Zhou as often now. And so for Zhong to say, well, I dream of the Duke of Zhou now, right? I am in direct contact, right, with that truncated teaching, I think is very telling. And then, of course, the others in the Joseon dynasty, with Zhong Dozhong. Now this is again a very interesting case, because he's not considered to be a very first-rate Confucian philosopher per se, but look at his name, right? Transmission of the Tao. So what you're talking about is indeed this very conscious effort made to make the claim that what they're doing is dead serious. What they're doing is something of such fundamental importance. And so he's the so-called architect, right, of the Joseon dynasty's whole governmental structure, because he was a close associate of Taizhou, the founder, Izongge. And so what he did was to articulate in that very Korean way, right, the whole yearning to perhaps even go beyond the Chinese, to rediscover a past that may be devoid of that Chinese interlude. And later on, I'll talk a little bit about that whole fascination with Kija, right? with the founder, right, of an almost legendary Korea. But at the same time, Zhong was an ardent anti-Buddhist. Right? he considered to be his foremost task, to get rid of this stranglehold, to try to rid Korea of this specter, if you will. And he was unsparing, right, in his effort in doing so. And he was the one who mapped out a whole detailed plan of how the new dynasty should be structured. So again, we're not talking about armchair philosophizing. Right? We're talking about an actual implementation of this Confucian vision. And his associate, not always a cordial colleague, but at the same time, someone who agreed with that vision, someone who was equally anti-Buddhist, right? Guan Gun. And so what you have then is, during the first reign, right, of the founder of the Yi dynasty, you have very pragmatic-minded Neo-Confucians who basically had this self-ascribed role to play. Right? They're going to create a civilization. They're going to create a socio-political order in their understanding of what the Confucian mission is all about. And that's exactly what they did. Now, of course, the other two, Yi Toige and Yoguk, they were the giants, right, of the Yi dynasty, Neo-Confucian movement. But again, I'm not going to talk about their philosophical positions. I mean, many of you are much more knowledgeable about that than I do, right? The 4-7 discussion and all those debates on what is principle, what is ether, what is Li and Qi, and all those issues. I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm more interested in what kind of actual work they did. Right? The creation of community compacts, right? The establishment of private academies, the kind of local activities that they undertook as leaders, as advocates of a new social organization. Those were the things that distinguished them. And of course, later on when I talk about the characteristics of this this Korean Neo-Confucian movement, I will say a little more. Okay, this I already addressed. So, they expressed a very pragmatic way of implementing this Confucian vision. Community compact, Hyangyak. We're not talking about all these abstruse metaphysical discussions. We're talking about how to organize the local villages, the local communities, into some kind of a Confucian community, right, based upon an expected set of behavior by everybody in that community, with all kinds of encouragements and sanctions, so that together, right, the very goal of a Confucian order can be realized. And then, of course, discussions about the granary system that would provide livelihood, that would provide sustenance for the people. And then, of course, a whole movement of founding academies to pursue that goal, to create an intellectual elite, so that this Neo-Confucian vision can be perpetuated forward. And then, of course, the actual performance of this vision locally, within the family, in terms of setting up family shrines, in terms of observing those mourning rituals, those wedding ceremonies, those annual festivals, all precisely and detailedly mapped out. And then, of course, for the elites, that kind of activity, of course, would be beneficial. But ultimately, it is the ruler who needs to be converted as well. Right? And of course, realizing that there's this very strong Buddhist heritage, it required quite a bit of effort on their part, right, to really try to bring home the idea that the ruler had to be himself Confucian. And it's through those royal lectures and all those practices to educate the crown prince, right, that would allow, that would guarantee the continuous subscription of this idea, of this vision, down through time. We're getting close to the end. So you have the Japanese expression of this movement. And of course, in Japan, the movement came quite late for the same reason that it did so in Korea, because most of Japanese medieval history was dominated by Buddhism. And of course, the Buddhists were the ones who had acquired these Confucian and later Neo-Confucian texts for a long time, but for obvious reasons, they were not the ones to trumpet that and to expound on that, because it would not be self-serving. But beginning in the 16th century, right at the time when this very chaotic situation, which was later Ashikaga Japan, would now be done away with, and the reunification of the country by the Tokugawa regime, the Tokugawa Bakufu, would usher in this very vibrant movement in Neo-Confucianism, beginning with, in fact, the first 3 individuals were all Buddhist monks at one time. And now it reached the point where it's the very participants, the very practitioners of that despised and criticized tradition now coming forward to embrace, in a very public way, their version of the Confucian, of the Neo-Confucian message. So Fujiwara Seika, he was the one who basically said something about the primacy of Zhushi's interpretation. And in fact, he obtained his inspiration from Korean Neo-Confucians. So the Japanese conquest of Korea, or attempted conquest of Korea by Toyotomi Hideyoshi towards the end of the 16th century, beginning in 1592, actually had this unexpected result, which was, of course, the capturing of many of the Neo-Confucian scholars and their arrival in Japan. And so Fujiwara Seika was the one who had meetings with these Confucian scholars and was greatly inspired by their teachings. And so now he was the one then who would trumpet the teachings of Master Zhu. But at the same time, he would also talk about how Confucianism could parallel some of the native indigenous religious ideas, represented by the Shinto ideas as well. And in fact, that argument would be made by his student, Hayashi Razan. Now, Hayashi Razan, the Hayashi school, the Hayashi family, in fact, would become the very representative, right, of this Confucian tradition in Tokugawa Japan, because that family had been designated to be the, shall we say, the Pope, right, of this Neo-Confucian movement in Japan. Hayashi family members would be designated the head of this temple, this college that would articulate this official Tokugawa understanding of the Neo-Confucian message. But what is so distinctive about Hayashi Razan was his attempt made to equate this Neo-Confucian model, which in the case of China and Japan had been primarily civilian, right, scholarly in its orientation, to apply that to the samurai ideal. So almost right from the beginning, we see an attempt made by these Japanese Neo-Confucians to make the teaching much more applicable to the Japanese case. And of course, the Japanese case is so different from the Chinese and the Korean case, primarily because of this samurai ethos, this samurai military emphasis because of the particular situation. And you have Yamazaki Ansai, yet a third former monk, in fact, a Zen monk, who did not particularly serve the shogunate per se, but someone who was a side branch of the shogunal family. This daimyo of Aizu, this Koshina Masayuki, was a stepbrother of the third Tokugawa shogun. And so Yamazaki, serving under him, would articulate a very creative interpretation of the Neo-Confucian vision to Japan. He basically would insist that this Confucian ideology was actually represented by Shinto. So not just the samurai, but Shinto. And so looking back at many of the Shinto texts, Yamazaki would create, in his own very unique way, right, a merged version of Confucianism with Shinto, which he called Suika Shinto. And then in Yamaga Soko, we find a further enhancement of that attempt made, and that is to apply Confucianism to the entire military ethos in the eventual creation of what is later known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. And Yamaga in particular is of critical importance because he taught in a local domain, a feudal domain, that would later serve as the stage for one of Japan's most well-known samurai drama, which is, of course, captured by the story of Chu Shingura, right? The treasury of loyal retainers. So a lord was unjustly persecuted and sentenced to seppuku, and then his followers, all 47 of them, would resolve, would vow to avenge that injustice by killing their lord's enemy, and they did so in the most glorious way, and so that has always captured the imagination of the Japanese. And then you have in Kaibara Ekken a further development in the sense that Confucianism would be popularized, would be made accessible not only to the samurai elites, but to the commoners. In fact, to certain neglected groups like young people and women. And Kaibara was the one who would translate many of these Confucian classics into vernacular Japanese. And he was also someone who showed a very keen interest in broadening this Neo-Confucian emphasis by looking at the possibility of science as a way to express this Confucian outlook. So he studied botany. He engaged in what then was known as Dutch studies, rangaku, in a way that ultimately would yield all kinds of unexpected results. So it's that window into the outside world that would trigger in late Tokugawa Japan, this acceptance, right, of European developments and European technologies that ultimately undermined the foundational authority of the Tokugawa regime. I have absolutely over extended my presentation. I'll just wrap it up. So the Kija myth, right, very important because it also indicates some kind of a native transformation of that Neo-Confucian message. Kija is very important, right, for Korean nationalists because of the belief that he was the one who came to Korea, he was the one who brought culture to Korea, he was the one who basically established the independence of this Korean claim to civilization. And through him, therefore, Korea could somehow achieve parity with China, and in fact could even claim supremacy over China, because Korea did not have to go through all the various misunderstandings and distortions of the Confucian message. So you have the enshrinement of Korean masters at Confucian Temple, something that, of course, that was quite audacious, because now these Korean masters could be seen as true heirs to the Confucian teaching. But of course, this Korean Neo-Confucianism also expressed itself in a very interesting way. That is, the claim by the elites, by the Confucian scholar Yang Ban, to have monopolized that message and to allow themselves to claim hereditary rights. Now, to be sure, it is not what is written on paper in the law books, but in effect, then, it is a rather closed system that the Yang Ban had created, and so you see a Korean expression of this Neo-Confucian movement in a way that was different from, at least theoretically, the Chinese way that maintained a much more open system. Back to Japan, so you have the very awkward dual government in Japan that would not be tolerated either by China or by Korea, and yet it's a fact. Right? Shogunal power was different from imperial power. The shogun was not the tenno. And so you have this dual government, and how would you, as a Neo-Confucian scholar, interpret that very awkward fact? Right? Became a Japanese Neo-Confucian issue. And then, of course, the samurai, the very martial, militaristic emphasis of that tradition. Hayashi Razan actually once said, right, there's no true learning without arms, and there's no true arms without learning. Right? So right from the beginning, we see a Neo-Confucian understanding, very much informed by this very martial spirit that was medieval Japan. And likewise, right, you have the very rigid class distinction between the samurai and the remainder of the Japanese populace. And so we find ultimately then that across East Asia, right, you see a single vision proposed by the early fathers of the Neo-Confucian movement, but then somehow that vision would be interpreted, would be applied, implemented differently in Korea and in Japan. Of course, in China as well, you see a later evolution of this Neo-Confucian message, resulting in all kinds of distortions, corruptions, and abuses, thereby earning for Neo-Confucianism a very bad name. But ultimately, we must not lose sight of that original impulse, which was a reformational attempt made at a re-evaluation of values, an attempt, a very sincere attempt made to repossess a vision that was understood to have existed right from the beginning in the Confucian tradition, but somehow had been obscured by Buddhism. And so what we find then is a very vibrant movement that had seen its ups and downs. But I don't think the story is at the end yet. Right? We see Chinese, Japanese, Korean self-styled Confucians trying to recapture that spirit, trying to reinvigorate in contemporary society that same message. And so Neo-Confucianism has a way of going on and keeping on. And that is the ultimate message that I want to give. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I spoke way too long. Time for...
Working? Oh, there we go. We'll have a short Q&A. So
Okay.
I just have a mic to pass around. So just raise your hand.
Now, as I said, this is just my midterm paper. I don't have all the facts, nor do I know everything.
Speak right into it.
Hi, Kim, Cornell University Medical College. You mentioned and they generally reported that Confucianism was invaded by Buddhism, in a way, replacing some social orders and salvation issues. That triggered born of the Neo-Confucianism to revival of, as you mentioned. Yes. How do you project now, about almost 1,000 years later, that other religions come to East Asia, Christianity and Islam and so on? It's likely there should be another revival, Neo-Confucianism. What do you think and what shape it has to come and what you...
I have no idea what shape it will take, but at the same time, I want to report that indeed a new Neo-Confucianism is afoot. I read with great interest a book written by Daniel Bell, who teaches at Tsinghua University, who's a Canadian scholar who teaches philosophy at Tsinghua University in Beijing right now. And he has written a book called New Confucianism in China. He said the CCP, officially standing for Chinese Communist Party, would one day become CCP, the Chinese Confucian Party, because of what the Chinese government is doing, right? The creation of Confucian institutes, the designation of Confucian Prize to rival the Nobel Prize, the absolutely unabashed championship, right, of the Confucian value of harmony, right, in society. And so now this may be a cynical ploy on the part of the government, and yet at the same time, as you see the proliferation of the study of the analects by primary school kids, the very popularity of some of the popular lecturers on the Confucian teaching, you cannot help but regard that as a very good sign. And of course, in Korea, you see also people re-arguing, right, the point about the relevance of Confucianism in the contemporary scene. And of course, earlier in the 1980s already, right, with the economic takeoff in Korea, there's also talk about, well, instead of serving as the stumbling block to modernity and economic prosperity, maybe Confucianism has something to do with the four dragons phenomenon that swept across some parts of East Asia. And of course, in Japan, maybe there's no very overt movement to champion this Confucian mission, if you will. But I think that in the way the Japanese live family lives, in the way education is emphasized in Korea as well, you see the continuation of this Confucian ethos, not in any kind of conscious, overt way, but in fact, there's this New York Times reporter who was stationed in Japan for a long time, and he wrote a book called Confucius Lives Next Door, documenting the kind of life pattern that he observed as an outsider, to see how deeply entrenched this Confucian ethos is in contemporary Japan. So I don't know how it would unfold in the future, but I think that if history is any guide, this Confucian ability to survive challenges and other criticisms, it has a way of recombining, with new ideas to make itself relevant. So Neo-Confucianism, even though it's very critical of Buddhism, actually relied on a great deal of Buddhist discourse to articulate, its mission or its vision. And the way I argued my point, right, comparing the Confucian experience to the Hebrew or to the Christian, perhaps it's one way to look at this Confucian ability to use a different vocabulary, to use a different logic, perhaps, to make itself once again relevant to East Asia.
I think we'll go ahead and end it there if that's okay. Let's give another thanks to Professor
Well, thank you
Shek.
very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Shek. We'd like to also remind you on May 22nd, we have another program, New Perspectives on the Joseon Dynasty, on looking at how women fit in a Confucian society. And thank you for coming. And again, thank you, Professor Shek.
You're most welcome. I'm sorry that I just got carried away. Oh, you're most welcome.